Tachyon, Croyd, Cranston, Jack, Braun, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
Hello, welcome to Card Table. So before getting into sort of the content of Busted Flush, which is the next one in the series, volume 19, I thought I'd digress, as I do love to do, and talk a little bit about the structure of these sort of arcs that Wildcards does in this long-running series. You know, people who maybe are completely unfamiliar and are maybe looking at this series of 30 books and saying, boy, where would you even start? It just seems so labyrinthine and just would be such a Sisyphusian kind of undertaking at this point to try and start the series that is still ongoing. You know, there's at least 3 books announced, so it's at 30 now. It's going to be up to 33. There's at least 2 graphic novels that have been announced, in addition to the graphic novels that already exist. So I did an article, my very first article for Tor.com, sort of broke things down a little bit. There are other articles, and the authors themselves and George R.R. Martin himself have talked about this stuff. But I wanted to talk about one specific element of these arcs that they do that are usually 3 to 5 books long. These arcs within the overall 30-book arc of the series. There are a few interesting patterns that emerge that have just sort of seem to have evolved based on how the series comes together and how the arcs come together. They've often been referred to as triads, implying these sort of 3-book cycles, but as I think I've pointed out before, a lot of them, there's more exceptions to that than there are actual examples of that. Because when you look at the Puppet Man thing, they call that the Puppet Man Quartet. But also if you look at the Rocks, what they call the Rocks triad, they call it books 8, 9, and 11. But 10 really belongs in there too. So it really is 8, 9, 10, and 11. So once again, 4 books. And I mentioned that I consider volume 12 to be kind of a prelude to the Card Sharks triad. And so if you bunch 12 in there with 13 through 15, once again, you got 4 books. I would also argue that Death Draws 5, which brings John Fortune to the forefront. John Fortune is very much an integral part of the committee triad, which is books 18 through 20. And so Death Draws 5 being volume 17, you can kind of group that in with the committee triad, and then once again you're looking at 4 books. So really it's tetrads or quartets far more often than it's triads to my eye. That said, though, so Busted Flush is volume 19, which is ostensibly, putatively, the middle book of the committee triad. And so I thought I'd digress and just look at some of the interesting patterns that go with the second book of a triad, or the second book of a cycle, or the second book of an arc. So what that is in practice up to this point, volume 2, of course, is the second book in the initial arc. Volume 5, Down and Dirty, which is the second book of the Puppet Man stuff. And then book 9, which is the second part of the Rocks/Jumpers cycle. And then volume 14, which is ostensibly the second volume of the Card Sharks triad. And now volume 19, which is the second book of the committee triad. So interesting things that have emerged regarding, or interesting patterns that have emerged regarding that second book in the cycle. That these are not necessarily particularly astute observations, but they're interesting to kind of think about and talk about. And just because the series is unique in this regard, in the sense of, certainly not in the sense of having trilogies or tetralogies or anything like that, but unique in this multiple author setup. Trying to create these multiple book arcs with anything up to maybe a dozen participating authors, just in a single arc alone. So volume 5. So one of the interesting things about the first 5 books is that in the iBooks editions that were produced, that were published right around the turn of the millennium, George R.R. Martin was doing these afterwards that were published in these editions of the first 5 books, where he really went behind the scenes and talked a little bit about how the sausage is made, and really went into sort of the nuts and bolts of the process of these first 5 books. Very very warts and all. Sometimes admitting where he thought that he had misjudged, where he thought there were failings in a particular book. He was not shy about admitting that stuff, which I always like that kind of stuff, to see the nuts and bolts, warts and all look at the process, particularly for someone like me who's such a fan of Wildcards, and they loom so large in my own personal kind of They were as much a part of my childhood as these large sci-fi franchises like a Star Trek or something. As any Star Trek fan knows, if you're curious about how a particular episode was made, oh, you can find plenty of behind the scenes. But with wildcards, it's every little nugget of information that kind of emerges. I'm always very quick to seize on it because they're kind of rare. Was quite delighted the first time I read that essay that George R.R. Martin wrote. All the essays that he wrote for those first five books. But for Down and Dirty, that one is particularly enlightening and fascinating, I think, because he talks about how it was a particularly I guess painful birthing process in a way for that one. So if you look at the way these things are structured, the first books in the cycles, so you're looking at Volume 1, Volume 4, Volume 8, Volume 13, Volume 18. You're looking at anthologies of short stories by different authors where the continuity between them is loose. Not loose in the sense of there being continuity errors, loose in the sense of each story is just kind of self-contained and they all take place in the same world, but and sometimes a lead character from one might show up in a cameo or a very brief little supporting role in another story. If you think of a typical anthology of short stories by different authors, you can read those stories in any order. You can look at it and go, oh, author X, I'm really excited to read his story, but it's fifth in the anthology. I have to read 4 stories before I get to my guy. No, I don't. I'll just skip around. I can jump around and I could not read stories entirely. With volumes like Volume 1, Volume 4, Volume 8, even Volume 13, despite the fact that there's that, I mentioned that there's that urgent conspiracy theory story tying them all together. I guess less so with Volume 18. That's a little tighter. But certainly in that first phase of Wildcards, if you consider the first 15 books to be phase 1, you're looking at books where you could really, you could read the stories out of order, and you certainly wouldn't be confused, and I don't think you'd lose much. Like with Volume 1, you could definitely get away with that. Even Volume 4, because it's just different stops on this world tour starring different characters, not counting the interstitials. Obviously the interstitials are there very much to provide that continuity, but take the interstitials out of the equation and you're looking at pretty self-contained stories that you could read out of order. Even Volume 8, which with its development of the rocks and the jumpers, I think even that one you could probably, you might find yourself, if you were to do that for whatever reason and read the stories out of order, you might find a reference to ever since David died, and you might find yourself going, well, who's David? And then if you read a story that was earlier in the book, you'd go, oh, here's David. Oh, and look, he died at the end. Now I get it. But Volume 13 with all those flashback stories that are they all involve brushes with a conspiracy, but they all have different leads. They're set in different decades. So yeah, you could do it. Volume 18, I guess a little less so, but that's the Tor era, which there was maybe a different set of rules or just a different approach in the relaunch era. So then you get to the second volume in these triads, and now the story there's an overarching plot that really starts to connect the individual stories much more tightly, where they really now it's feeling like, even though it's still an anthology and it's still story A by author X and then story B by author Y, and etc. down the line, different stories, different lead characters, different authors. There's much more of a feeling of a passing of the narrative baton, where it's like, even though it's a new story, it is also, the next chapter, where you might find yourself, if you were to try to read those stories out of order, it would be just as sort of chaotic as if you were to just take a book with 30 chapters and say, I'm going to read chapter 27 first, and now I'm going to read chapter 15, and now I'll jump to chapter 20, and now I'll read chapter 6. So it's much more novelistic in those second arcs, because the narrative is getting tighter, and the stories are now getting more interlocked. And that, again, that's true of Volume 2, Volume 5, Volume 9, Volume 14, etc., etc. And sidebar within the sidebar, this is one of the reasons why I remember thinking, and I think I might have commented on this when I talked about Volume 9, when they were reissuing the books through Tor and they were adding new stories, they were generally picking the first books in a triad because those were the ones that had the loosest sort of structure with a much more anthology feel, where it doesn't feel that strange to just insert a story in between the cracks of two other stories, because the gap that you're inserting into is wide enough to accommodate that. So when they announced, like, oh yeah, volume 1's going to have new stories, and then they said, oh, volume 4 is also going to have new stories, volume 8 is going to have new stories, made sense. First book in the cycle. When they announced it for volume 9, which was the second book in the Jumper Rocks stuff, I remember thinking even at the time, that seems like there's much tighter continuity in volume 9, and everything is pretty interlocked. Those gaps are much smaller. And from my subjective opinion, I think that did turn out to be the case, that one was a little more dubious, that the volume 9, the new stories that are added in volume 9 are by Sherry Priest and Carrie Vaughn, respectively. And I mean, Vaughn and Priest, what's the line in Fargo? You got no complaints. As far as like the quality of the prose, Vaughn and Priest, you got no complaints. But in terms of how accommodating volume 9 was to new stories inserted in the cracks, the baton passes were already so slick, and precise, that to try and, add a new person to quickly move that baton became awkward. More wildcards prose by Carrie Vaughn, more wildcards prose by Sherry Priest is always a good thing. So don't get me wrong on that score. But end of digression. So here's what I wanted to get to was in the afterword to volume 5. So George R. R. Martin talks about the fact that there was pushback from the publisher. The original idea was it's a gang war storyline. Essentially, they had established two criminal fraternities. This mafia family with Rosemary Muldoon as our sort of entry point into that character, as the sort of what Al Pacino's character was to The Godfather. Rosemary Muldoon is that to this fictional wild cards mafia family. And then you had the Shadow Fist Society, who is Yeoman's antagonists. So of course it made sense. There's these two criminal organizations. They're both based in New York. How about a gang war between them? And they're both employing aces with superhuman powers, so it'll be very exciting. Plus they had this overarching plot involving Puppet Man, and they wanted to forward that along. And they also had this other arc with this other big bad named T. Melise. Plenty of narrative ground that Volume 5 had to cover. And then they got thrown a curveball when the publisher actually said, you know what, a gang war, that's not enough. That's not enough to support a whole book. You need something else. And so they kind of were like, oh, okay, how about there's a contagious form of the wild card, and even someone who's already an ace or a joker can get reinfected. So aces can become jokers and jokers can become aces, which that sounds like a premise for a whole book right there. But now it was just the fourth premise in a book that already had to deal with the gang war and with Puppet Man and with Team Elise. And so they had a lot of narrative ground to cover, and they had a lot of things that these stories needed to accomplish. And they also wanted to have the more interlocked, again, second book in the triad. So they wanted these stories to be really interlocked. And what they found as they were putting it together, these stories were so interlocked that it was hard to just even place them as here's one story, here's another, because they sort of were interwoven with each other. So they realized they had to break some stories apart into multiple, kind of chapters, so that that they could interweave more easily. So you could be like, here's the turtle chapter part 1, or here's the turtle story part 1, and now here's the Tachyon story part 1, and now here's Roger Zelazny's Croyd story part 1, and weave it in that way. Stories that I guess weren't originally conceived to do that. They sort of had to rewrite them into this new broken apart style. Leanne C. Harper's story about Rosemary Muldoon, Vagabond, had to be broken into 3 parts, and et cetera, et cetera. So the way Volume 5 ends up sort of coming together is that you've got half of the stories in there are broken into pieces, and then other stories like the one about Puppet Man, the one about Team Elise, the one there's the Yeoman story by John Joseph Miller. There's a story about Buddy Holly by Edward Bryant, kind of apropos of nothing. There's the one about Quasi-Man and Leo Barnett, written by Arthur Byron Cover. Those are still sort of kept intact as these sort of long stories intermingled with this sort of stew of broken apart stories. And Martin has said that he doesn't, I think from what I remember of that essay, he said that he doesn't quite really like how it's all put together, and it definitely does sort of create this kind of strange feel where And the whole contagious wildcard virus that Croyd is spreading, is kind of introduced pretty late into the book. Not until like 100 pages in or something. But it seems as if maybe the only reason Martin didn't like it is because it wasn't conceived that way. It was a solution that they had to sort of impose onto this collection of stories after the stories had already been conceived and written to be something else. But it seems like Martin wasn't necessarily opposed to this notion of breaking apart stories and having them interweave around each other, because when you get to the very next triad or multiple book arc, and you get to the second book in that arc, which is Volume 9, Jokertown Shuffle, they do the same thing again because, you've got the interstitial about Bloat by Stephen Lee, and the interstitials, those are the ones that are always broken apart, of course. In addition to the Bloat interstitial by Stephen Lee, Snodgrass's Tachyon story is once again broken into several parts. Walter John Williams's Black Shadow story is broken into 2 parts. And then when they did the interpolated stories, the new ones for the Tor edition by Carrie Vaughn and Sherry Priest, they did more breaking apart. Sherry Priest's story is just broken into 4 parts, boom, right away, right out of the gate. And not only that, but her little bits are inserted in between other stories, so that the Walter John Williams 2-parter is now broken into 3 parts. Victor Milan's Captain Tripp story, which was originally just one long, unbroken kind of novella-length piece in that book, that gets broken in half, so that one of the Sherry Priest bits can slot in between. So this idea of just breaking up all these stories seems like Martin came around on it and maybe was like, hey, let's do it. In Marked Cards, Volume 14, the second part of the Card Sharks triad, there's a little less of that, although once again, Walter John Williams, he has another Black Shadow story, and once again, it's broken up into 2, it's broken in half. So there's a little bit of doing that. Then when we get to Busted Flush, there's a lot of that. So it's really just about every story. There's like 1 or 2 that aren't, but almost every story in that. Snodgrass has a multi-part interstitial starring Noel, kind of James Bondish kind of character that was first introduced in the previous book, Inside Straight. He's the lead in the interstitial. There's one by Caroline Spector about Bubbles that's broken into 3 parts. There's a co-written piece by Walton Simons and Ian Tregellis that's broken into 4 parts, I believe. Carrie Vaughn's Curveball story is at least broken into 2. The Drummer Boy story is broken into parts. Kevin Andrew Murphy's Cameo story broken into several parts. So that one, they really lean into it, where it really is like almost every story in there is disassembled or made into a serial, so that the story can kind of leapfrog amongst the different pieces. So whatever Martin might have thought originally, again, if you read that afterward to Down and Dirty, Volume 5, he seems displeased at their solution of breaking stories into pieces. But by the time you get to Busted Flush, I guess busted has a double meaning in this context, where they suddenly they're really willing to kind of like take a sledgehammer to these stories and bust them into multiple pieces. So that they can kind of mix them all around into this kind of narrative stew. Interesting to look at some of the way they have structured these Wildcards books over the years, because it's in many ways sometimes the structure of these books is as interesting as the content. So next time we'll move on from the structure of Busted Flush and we'll look more at the actual story content. So join me, won't you?
To try and give our love back some sparks. He said, we'll get your love growing. But before we get going, may I highly recommend Cod Shocks? I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. Lately we've had some friction, 'cause my baby's hooked on shared world fiction.